Hi, I'm Josh Corman. I'm the founder of Am the Cavalry.org, was the chief strategist for the CISA COVID task force during the pandemic, and am a head of cyber safety strategy for Claroty. And you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 302 for December 12th, 2022. And I've got a really good interview for you today. We're going to be talking with Josh Corman, and he has done many things. But the thing that brought me to him was a group called Am the Cavalry. And this is an organization that he helped start several years back now. And the idea being that the cavalry's not coming. So therefore, it needs to be you. In the sense of we have a lot of cybersecurity problems that need to be fixed, and we can't just rely on someone else to get these things done. And you don't have to be in a high-tech position to do this. There's a lot of things that all of us could do. But anyway, he has worked for the U.S. government. He has worked in a lot of organizations, and it has done some amazing things. And it's a very sobering and philosophical discussion, and I really enjoyed it. I've been trying to get Josh on the show for a long time, but he's a very busy person, as you will soon see. And we just had a really great discussion. I think you're going to find this inspiring. I know I did. Okay, before we get started, a couple things. First of all, the big giveaway is still going on. You've got time to enter the raffle, and you can enter multiple ways and multiple times. To get the information, go to FDSD, that's Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons, FDSD.me/EP300 as in episode 300. I kicked it off a couple weeks ago with the big 300th episode, so we're kind of celebrating that. I'm giving away almost $2,000 worth of stuff to 5 winners, 1 grand prize winner and 4 regular winners. You can get all the details by going to that link. And that giveaway will run through the end of the month, through December, till basically New Year's Eve, Eastern time. And also during the month of December, I've got a big patron promotion going on as well. This is for new and existing patrons. If you sign up for an annual membership, you got to sign up for a full year. But if you sign up for an annual membership at the right level, you will qualify for one of my super cool security enhancing Dragon Challenge Coins swag packs. That includes one of my really cool Dragon Challenge coins that also act as a D20 die, so you can use that coin to generate passphrases from my website, d20key.com, and some other cool swag stuff as well. So for that one, go to fdsd.me/coinpromo, COINPROMO, and all the details will be there. Now, if you're still looking for some holiday gifts and you want to make sure that something you give is going to be secure and private, I have my annual best and worst gift guide. You can go to the Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons website. It'll be one of my recent articles there. I've also decided that this year I wanted to create something. I wanted to make something that you guys could give away to your loved ones to help them improve their security and privacy. So I created a bunch of coupons that you can hand out. You know, these are for things like setting up a password manager or setting up two-factor authentication or, improving the security of a home network, that kind of stuff. So check that out. It's on my best and worst gift guide. Again, just go to my website. You'll find that, and you'll find a link to these downloadable free PDF coupons you can give out. Little stocking stuffers. And by the way, you don't have to do this for the holidays. There's nothing on them that says, that it's a holiday thing. But if this is a great time to do that, but you could do it all year round as well. I am adding some more coupons, so there will be a V2, a version 2 of that PDF file. So be on the lookout for that. And then finally, as always, I'm collecting questions for the Dear Carrie segment of the news shows. So send me your questions and I will answer them on the air. And again, go to fdsd.me/Q&A for all the details about how to go about doing that. Okay, so let's talk about today's interview. Again, this is really pretty sobering. It's a very serious conversation about cybersecurity, and not just about ransomware and how people might lose some money, or you might have to buy a new computer, or identity theft. Those are all bad things. Those are all things that are not fun to deal with. But Josh is really focused on where cybersecurity failures cause harm, like direct harm to people, or death in some cases. He was working at CISA during the pandemic, for example, when the hospitals were already overcrowded. And so anything that might cause a delay in care, or if the hospitals were too full and you had to go to a different hospital, or, there was some sort of a malware attack at the hospital that caused some of the key services to go down. But also things like Colonial Pipeline, where people lost the ability to get gas. The hacks that caused problem with the meatpacking industry. The hack that potentially could have caused horrible poisons to be put in the water supply. These are the kind of things that are very possible now, and they're starting to happen. And so he's very focused on the very ultra practical ways that we can improve our security. A couple things he mentions that I want to give you a little briefing on before we get into it, so you know what he's talking about. He talks about Jeff Moss. I've interviewed Jeff Moss. He's the founder of DEF CON. Their whole I Am the Cavalry thing kind of get kicked off in DEF CON 21. There's a link in the show notes to that video that I encourage you to watch. My interview with Jeff Moss was also a lot of fun. If you want to go back and check that out, there's also a link in the show notes for that. He also whips out a phrase called left of boom. And you may not be familiar with this. There's a whole shift left movement in software development and other areas as well. But the idea being, if you're looking at a timeline, so that left is earlier in time and toward the right is later in time. Ideally, when you're trying to fix problems and prevent things from happening, you want to shift left. You want to get them fixed earlier in the process, because the later you catch something that is bad or needs fixing, the more expensive it is to fix, because you basically got to go back and repeat a lot of things you've already done. So shift left is sort of an optimization thing. It's sort of a privacy or security by design thing. But when we're talking about left of boom, in that case, the boom is something bad. Something really bad happens. So you want to be operating as much as possible to the left of the boom, earlier than the boom. That is, you want to be working on preventative stuff, or at least be prepared for when the bad things happen. So when it does happen, you can, maybe mitigate the damage, or if you've done a really good job, maybe prevent it and sidestep it completely. So when he mentions left of boom, that's what he's talking about. These are preventative and proactive measures that you can take, to prevent or limit harmful consequences. He also talks about SBOM, or software bill of materials. I actually interviewed Alan Friedman a couple of years ago on this concept. I think it's extremely important. I think it's a great idea. Basically, it's kind of a list of ingredients for your software. And that's really important because software today is really a patchwork quilt of libraries, what we call software libraries and software development kits. And they come from all over the place. Some of them are open source, some of them are not. But your software applications that you run today are really a piecemeal, kind of a Frankenstein of other people's software. And as I'm fond of saying, all software has bugs. And therefore, the more pieces of software you have, the more potential chinks you have in your armor. And so it's important to know what your software is made of, so that if one of those piece parts has a known vulnerability, you know that is in your software, and you know that you need to update that. He also talks about Maslow's pyramid, or hierarchy of needs. Maslow is an American psychologist who came up with this idea of you're used to the food pyramid, but this was a needs pyramid, in order of the things that we as humans, or maybe even as a society, need to figure out first. For example, it's a pyramid. So at the very bottom, the thing that we absolutely cannot live without, literally, are physiological needs. We need air, we need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need sleep, those sorts of things. And then above that is, safety. We want some security, maybe employment, for financial security. We have certain resources, our health. And then above that is love and belonging. Above that is esteem. And then finally, at the very tippy top is self-actualization. So he likens a lot of the things that we need to do in cybersecurity to kind of, looking at this pyramid of needs, like getting the very basic stuff from that first and make sure we focus on that stuff. All right, I don't want to waste any more time. Let's get to our interview with Josh Corman. Josh Corman is VP of Cyber Safety at Claroty, founder of I Am the Cavalry, and formerly served as the Chief Strategist for CISA, CISA, regarding COVID, healthcare, and public safety. He previously served as CSO of PTC, Director of Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, CTO for Sonatype, as many, many other senior roles. Josh, it's been a long time coming. I'm so glad to finally have you on the show.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for your patience as life threw us curveballs.
Yes, and congrats on the wedding and all that stuff. That's fantastic. I'm happy to have been delayed by such a wondrous event.
Yes, it was a wonderful hacker reunion as well.
All right. So despite your new gig, actually, what I'd love to talk to you about today is your role with I Am the Cavalry. I think that's really cool, and I want to kind of explore that group and the kind of things you've done. So to start off, why don't you tell us a little bit about I Am the Cavalry, how it evolved, over the last 7 to 8 years?
It's 9 now. Turned 9 on August 1st. My origin story changes depending on my mood. I mean, it's the same story. It's just how much verbosity and how personal I get. But I do like your longer format. I'm a philosopher hacker. I just always want to be a superhero, but I didn't look good in tights. And I certainly wasn't a technically prowess hacker. But I care a lot about protecting people and good versus evil and hard problems. And it turns out my otherwise useless philosophy degree turned out to be incredibly valuable during, as the world and society and the species grew more dependent on connected technology starts to really affect public safety, human life, social contracts, social stability. So when I saw the rise of anonymous and hacktivism, I started taking more risks, and I realized that my social contract theory was quite relevant. And I was advising UN and NATO and others on this new emergent property of the internet. And I was very worried it was going to lead to things like cyber terrorism, and it ultimately did. If you want to circle back to that, it's pretty scary what happened. But I got as high and deep as you can get in the federal government. I got permission to bring 5 world-class hackers with me to spend 2 days at Fort Meade with General Alexander and his 5 top people. And we had to answer some real big challenge questions. There was a House bill and a Senate bill. They were trying to decide how to regulate cyber. And after, we did 2 incredibly intense days. And there's a personal part of the story and there's a factual part of the story. But the factual part was at the end of 2 days, they couldn't act on a single one of our great ideas from our single challenge question, not even one. And these world-class hackers and I were at the bar kind of licking our wounds and no one was speaking. And I just kind of uttered reflexively, hey guys, the cavalry isn't coming. No one's going to save us. And the personal bit of this is that between night 1 and 2, I had to leave quickly to go to my car and do some guest lecturing at George Washington. And I got back to several voicemails to find out a bunch of people saying, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Josh. I'm so sorry. I'm like, what the hell are they talking about? And eventually I got to one of my sisters, and it turned out my mom's stroke was actually the front wave of pretty aggressive brain cancer. So I didn't tell the team what I was going through. We just muscled through. But as we hospiced her over the next several months, the last time she was going to go see her church and say goodbye to her friends was the Sandy Hook shooting. And instead of saying goodbye to her friends, we got lectured to for 2 hours about why is there evil in the world? Why is there evil? And never answering the question. And I just remember being scared for my little girls who were scared that they're losing to go to school, who were scared that they're losing their grandma, and everyone's crying and everyone's shattered. And I just remember being mad. And, a couple months later, she passes. We go back to that same church for the first time since then. And I was angry again. You don't want to be angry at your mom's funeral. So I sat in the car for a long time and I didn't want to go in. I was listening to some Tool. And when I finally went in, I had to metabolize that anger. And as I tried to find some positive spin, I said, last time we were here, as I gave my remarks, I said, I was angry because it was Sandy Hook and we were overwhelmed, we were confused. And I didn't like the question of why is there evil in the world? I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just did. My mom got to be my 7th grade science teacher. She didn't even have a teaching degree at the time. She was going to school to be a teacher and she had to fill in for somebody. She was an amazing teacher. And of many things we learned from her is that darkness wasn't a thing. It was an absence of light, and that cold isn't a thing. It's an absence of heat. So I said, maybe it's not just the presence of evil, but the absence of good. And if something's missing, we got to put it there. So I said, what's the absence of Marie, my mom's name? And I didn't even have an answer, but I just was speaking from the heart, and something came to me. I'm like, well, we don't get to find out because now it falls to us to do what she was doing. As soon as I said that, I'm like, I kind of know what I have to do. Time's precious. An average lifespan is not a guaranteed minimum lifespan, and what matters and what doesn't. So I kind of, in my mourning process, built up in my raw, shattered empathy state where I'm just raw feelings every day. I kind of said, you know what? I'm going to stop being an imposter syndrome and pulling my punches. It's like, no one's going to fix these things. I'm really worried about them. So let me see if I can ask the hacker community, what are you willing and able to do? So at DEF CON that year, we said, hey, the cavalry isn't coming. What can we do? And we said, let's be a voice of reason, a helping hand, where every bits and bytes are meat, flesh, and blood. Initially, we had like 50 people. And then Jeff Moss gave us this is at B-Sides, Las Vegas. Jeff Moss ended up giving us the main stage Saturday or Sunday morning as well. So we did the talk again to the full room. And I think it's still one of the top 10 DEF CON talks each year they list out. But we were just kind of saying, we're ahead of society and culture in a lot of ways. We're a bunch of misfits, and we like our, being puzzlers and protectors and prestige and profit and protest. But as the world increasingly depends on technology, they increasingly depend on us. So I just said, if you're willing and able, let's meet at DerbyCon, form our wants, needs, fears in our constitutional Congress of the sorts. And at this point, we have several thousand volunteers, some hackers, some nurses and doctors, some public policy makers, some think tank people. But it's a coalition of willing that just says medical, auto, high-speed rail, aviation, maritime, public utilities, power, electric, gas. These things are hackable. And you haven't asked this yet, but during I guess I'll just punctuate that was 9 years ago, and we were trying to be left a boom and warn people. And we said no one will listen until there's loss of life. Well, during my emergency federal service, we saw the first loss of life from ransom attacks, protracted outages, and I got to publish that with data science during my federal service. And in parallel, while we were living out the cavalry mission with a couple of us actually as emergency hires temporarily in CISA, zoom out and think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, water, shelter, safety. We had successful attacks on the water we drink, the food we put on our table, oil and gas pipelines for the Eastern Seaboard, to fuel our cars, our homes, and our supply chains, the schools your kids go to, municipalities who run towns and cities, the federal agencies charged with national security, and even timely access to patient care during a once in 100-year pandemic with lethal outcomes. Shit's on fire. And, the things we were warning about, the manifest harm, right? We were always kind of vulnerable, but as you add more connectivity, you're increasing your exposure. The adversaries have become more brazen and willing to attack what was previous off limits and critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
The impacts are higher now. They're not record count or money. It's loss of life or patient care outcomes or no fuel. Imagine if that Colonial Pipeline happened in the winter and we couldn't get heating oil. So I think we were on the right path. The question is, do we have the political will and stomach to make the necessary changes?
So yeah, you guys, a lot of times when we talk about this, and I do this as well, when I talk about things that happen in the news that are cybersecurity related, we focus a lot on the money. We focus a lot on, commercial impacts, ransom paid, and cryptocurrency scams and things like that. You guys are much more focused on actual physical harm. How does that focus change your overall philosophy? How does that change your approach to cybersecurity?
Well, I think you hear this cliche a lot, but I think we really mean it. Cybersecurity, is not an end unto itself, right? The term resilience is battered around a lot, but people don't really even know what it means or define it similarly. But what we really want is consistent, maintainable, resilient performance so that when you turn your water faucet on, you have clean, drinkable water. When you turn the light switch on, the power comes on. When you drive a car, you're not worried that somebody can turn the steering wheel hard to the right or kill the brakes, right? When you depend on medical technology to scale the patient to nurse ratio in a hospital, you want that force multiplier to stay intact so that you can have your full carrying capacity and safely care for patients. So what we really want is we trust these technologies and these services. We want to make sure that trust is well placed. I think for us, sometimes the answer is you add more cybersecurity aftermarket, but rarely. Mostly, as many of us that have been doing this long enough, what we realize is sometimes the best way to improve security is to reduce complexity. It's not to add more stuff. It's to remove stuff. It's not so much to defend 15 internet-facing attack surfaces. It's to have fewer attack surface reduction. It's not about defending indefensible things that are unsupported with hard-coded passwords. It's understanding which things are unsafe at any speed and replacing them with more modern defensible IT. And so I think a lot of what I teach for my CMU course and a lot of the AppSec and ProductSec stuff I've done, rugged DevOps and DevSecOps early work, was cybersecurity is like the third or fourth wave of having defensible, maintainable, reliable infrastructure. So this critical infrastructure, you can have alternatives as well. So sometimes it's not defending this particular IT, it's having a backup alternative supply. During the vaccine supply chain work, I couldn't necessarily prevent attacks against some of these rare manufacturers of critical ingredients for DNA and mRNA vaccines. The right cybersecurity strategy wasn't cybersecurity. It was, we need to have an alternative manufacturing site in case this one goes down.
Right.
So sometimes it's part of your overall risk program, which is the cliche. It's part of your overall resilience strategy, which is often misattributed. And it's usually about making sure that your dependence on a thing is proportional to how dependable it is.
Yeah.
So when these things are hackable, you should have appropriate expectations and backups. And when the cost of wrong or the cost of failure is too high, then you shouldn't connect it to the internet. It's not a right to be connected, to have cyber physical systems on the internet with FTP or hard-coded passwords or no factor authentication. Forget multi-factor authentication. So I just think I've always brought that mindset. And as we had a lot of the people who opted into this work in these critical infrastructure areas, and they know their constraints, I just think we have a pragmatism where we don't focus on activities and inputs. We focus on outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you guys are, I noticed in a lot of the talks and things that I've seen you do, you focus a lot on empathy and you focus a lot on what you call meeting people where they are.
Yes.
Tell me what that means to you and how that plays out and what you guys do.
Well, I would say that generally the talent pool and demographic that was attracted to hacking did not have a lot of empathy organically or natively, and that includes me. In fact, I'm probably butchering some of these terms, but I found when I was emotionally shattered in the death process and afterwards for my mom, I initially looked at it as weakness, like I can't wait till I'm less of a mess. But what I observed as I was coming out of the fog, I likened it to being in a boxing fight or having a grenade go off near you, where I was just shell shocked and my sight was blurred and my hearing was blurred, but your senses slowly come back to you. And what I realized in the middle of that was, wait, this isn't weakness. I'm having truly authentic human connection with people. Like, we're past the superficial. We're talking in a real way. There's a certain nakedness to it, but that engenders reciprocity. And I kind of chose, I'm going to hold on to this as long as I can, because these are better conversations. And we're really getting to the substance past the surface. I didn't know if it would work. And there's lots of reasons if you want to double click as to, I studied this a lot and learned, where does empathy get developed? And it's a muscle you can develop. We just, most of us didn't develop it. And I said, you can keep being a pointing finger at past failures and say everything's broken and fail whale, or we could try to be a helping hand for future success. Like we can look at what's wrong with something. That's easy. Or we can look at what's right with it and treat it like a little spark or an ember and foster it into a flame. And we're going to win more friends with, common ground than we are going to be with criticism. And I would see really talented hackers find a medical device flaw and be really upset that no one was fixing it and they weren't being heard. And I said, let's try something new. So we meet people where they are. We use their love language. We tried a bunch of different ways to speak and listen to the nouns and verbs they used. And when we built trust and built empathy, then we could ask for things and then we could be heard. People don't listen until they're first listened to. Mm-hmm. So maybe I had to be emotionally shattered to try this, but I think we found the more empathetic subgroups. And when people saw our successes, the more angry finger pointy people said, hell, let's try their method. And some of those people who found the flaws I could never find, I helped them get turned into the first ever recalls, for regulated devices before anyone got hurt. And since we do deep down want to be problem solvers, we looked at this less as how do I find a device and break a device and report the break of the device, and more about how do we not just hack and fix a single flaw in a single medical device from a single medical device maker, but how do you hack the law? How do you hack public policy so that you protect all devices?
Right.
And boy, when it started working, there's nothing more contagious than success. And a lot of our critics turned into teammates. So
another phrase that you have used quite a bit is target rich and cyber poor. A lot of these organizations and groups that you're working with are ripe targets for attack, and yet have very little skills or budget or personnel or however you want to look at it to attack these things. So when you run into groups like that, what are your go-to recommendations? How do you start with groups that have so far to go?
Well, let me constrain my answer to the last intense couple of years of the pandemic, because the Cavalry's met people where they are since day one, but we didn't use this phrase until somewhat recently. In fact, I used it in CISA because I'm very fond of giving credit where credit's due. This is a permutation of the wisdom from Wendy Nather when she worked for me at the 451 group and then eventually took over. She has this great phrase of the security poverty line and living below the security poverty line. So the notion that not everyone has the resources to do what they need to do or that what they should do, that's all credit to her. In the context of the federal government and the federal language, initially I went in to protect the 7,000 hospitals that deliver patient care in the country from record high ransomware during record high patient loads. And what I warned Chris Krebs, Director Krebs at the time when he was hiring me, they said 85% of the hospitals in the country don't have a single security person on staff based on our task force report.
Wow.
Like, you can't just tell them to do zero trust or best practices. It's not going to work.
Right.
So we have to be very pragmatic. Yeah. And I hope you're willing and able to be nimble if I'm going to come in. What I didn't know is, in parallel with onboarding us, that's when Operation Warp Speed was stood up to accelerate the development and distribution of vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, and medical equipment, to save as many lives as possible. And those supply chains also, other than the very big players that have, hundreds of people on their risk management teams, for the pharmaceutical primes, the subprimes and all their downstream supply chains were teeny tiny and no security programs. So what they both had in common is they were target rich in that they were very attractive to adversaries for some reason, either because they knew hospitals would pay during a pandemic or because they knew that this was important to vaccine supply chains.
Right.
Target rich just meant how attractive are you to the bad guys, and resource poor. The long version is you could be resource poor or cyber poor for one of the following three things, one or more. You could either be information poor and that you just didn't know. You could be incentives poor and that you knew better, but there were insufficient carrots and sticks to make you do the right thing for national security, for public safety. I'm sure you can think of a few of those right now. Yeah. And the last one was the most common, which is resource poor. They just didn't have a single security person. When I was handed a list of 1,000 suppliers to the 7 prime candidates for Operation Warp Speed to save millions of people, we ended up making a list of 4,000, not one. But out of those 4,000, we found 66 that we called ball bearings, the small, unguarded, weak links in the supply chain that, if disrupted, would have the most profound impact on loss of life. And the top of my list, by far, I'm not going to tell you the name, but they were critical path to all the DNA and mRNA candidates. They were the only manufacturer in the world. They had one site. And when we finally met them after a long period of trying to find them to help them and buy down risk, they had 3 IT people. None of them were cybersecurity people. You could have sneezed on them. They were all over Shodan. They were all, no hacking required. Just log in or just shut stuff off or do denial of service attack. And I was, we lost sleep. We were just like, there's no way we can do a year-long, 3-year-long project to harden their network. So to answer your question, and what do you do? It really depends on what your time horizon is and how pragmatic and gritty you want to get. But we developed at least a pragmatic security suite, we called it. But a couple of things we did in parallel, and I'll rapid fire them, but each one are fascinating depending on how much your audience wants these things. They're going to sound kind of defeatist, but the first thing I said is stop uttering best practices at them. Like, what are the bad practices? Let's flip this on its head. So we wrote CISA.gov/bad practices. And we said, these are dangerous. In critical infrastructure, these are dangerous. And the lawyers tried to stop me several different times, and I just wouldn't let go. And they said, but Josh, isn't this common? I said, it is common and dangerous. Our job is to identify risks to critical infrastructure. These are among the top. So from memory, they all have the same sentence structure, but from memory, it was initially 2, now it's 3. And by the time you air this, it might be 4. The use of unsupported end-of-life software in service of critical infrastructure and national critical functions is dangerous. It materially elevates risks to public safety, economic, and national security. Yeah. This dangerous practice is especially egregious for internet accessible technologies. Boom, right? Yep. Well, when the Microsoft Exchange attacks were happening, the number one market share of Exchange on the internet, according to Bob Brutus in his scan from Rapid7, was unsupported Exchange. It wasn't an exception. It wasn't a rare edge case. It's the majority. Most medical devices are running XP or Windows 7, both of which are end of life. Oh, right. And end of life software should not be end of life for humans. And we're playing fast and loose. Number 2 is the same sentence structure, but for hard coded fixed maintenance passwords. Yeah. And the third one was the use of single factor remote administration tools, which is one they picked after the initial launch. So 1 is bad practices. I shouldn't have gone that detailed. I'm sorry. Number 2 is we said, let's get it's something I teach my students at CMU, but I like to say, get your stuff off Shodan, but I couldn't say the euphemism for stuff in a federal document. I couldn't say Shodan. So we said, get your stuff off search. And there was a series of documents that show you how to use free tools like Shodan, Census.io, Thinkful to see your internet attack surface, see what adversaries can see. And so you can harden the ones you don't, shut off the ones you don't need, harden the ones you do. But it gives you a really free, easy way to see your low-hanging fruit for opportunistic attacks. That was a gateway drug, though, because taxpayers already fund cyber hygiene vulnerability scanning nightly. So you get an automated scan and email of all the vulnerabilities that are remotely accessible. And that's too much. So when we meet them where they are, they're not going to be able to fix all those. So we also encouraged and accelerated the publication in machine readable formats for what's KEV. And people love KEV, but KEV is the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. So in a given year, less than 3% of CVEs ever get exploited. This KEV list is not even that 3%. It's a subset of the 3%, which are the most commonly exploited known CVEs out there that have affected critical infrastructure. So let's zoom out for a second. You should know what these bad practices are, because we were encouraging regulators, insurers, underwriters, credit rating agencies, FTC, SEC. We were encouraging them all to make these considered negligent. Couldn't use the word negligent, but we're trying to define a floor that you could bring to your board of directors and your investors. 2, we said, here's an easy way to get your stuff off search, but you really should do this on an automated way. We'll do it for free for you. And then since you can't fix everything, at least in this urgent, immediate sense, before you budget and hire and train, you should probably fix the KEVs, the non-exploited vulnerabilities. So this is super defeatist in some ways, right? It doesn't make you safe. And many of these hacks could still happen through phishing or spam or another vector. But how many disruptions to water, food supply, oil and gas, hospitals, municipalities were opportunistic collections of a drive-by for a mass exploitation like exchange?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? I mean,
so much. VPNs, Citrix, you name it, especially the internet. And I really like the kicker and the bad practices, which is especially internet reachable technologies.
Absolutely.
Oh, by the way, that's not the finish line. That was to get them to the starting line. The whole idea is subsequent to doing those minimums, then you crawl, walk, run, and have a phased approach that's fit for purpose for your sector.
So what's next then? After they're crawling, what's the walk and the run?
Well, for those that we designated as those 66 ball bearings, we would send out a CISA regional team, and we'd help do a guided tour through a lightweight pass through like the NIST cybersecurity framework, or things like, for me, the most obvious ones we did the most often for these ball bearings, we called them, was we would try to do a very lightweight tabletop crisis simulation to test their assumptions. We would sometimes ask a subset of the questions about, is there separation between your OT and your IT, your front office and your cyber physical systems? Because maybe a compromise of your front office computers wouldn't have an explosion or a plant breakdown.
Right. But
to properly do that is a very long engagement. But we were looking for what can be addressed immediately, because we were getting pretty close to scaled production and fill and finish for at least the first emergency authorized use candidates. And so we had to time box these things. What can we do right now? But the idea was, let's do a couple common things for these industrial OT IT splits immediately. But then it was walking through, do you have a backup offline storage restoration, or doing a tabletop crisis simulation, a lightweight one, so you can get executive stakeholder engagement and challenge assumptions. But there's so many other things in the CISA service catalog that, instead of just saying use all of these, the Socratic process of finding out what their current skills, appetites, and demographic were would help them say, do these next, these next, these next. But it created a relationship. And often, in many cases, as designated critical infrastructure, they get access to free taxpayer-funded services. It's just they don't know what they mean.
Yeah.
And heck, I've been in cyber a long time. The language CISA uses is different than the language I would use in the private sector. So it's not perfect, but some of our other teammates, after my service ended, they've been trying to clean up and streamline how you articulate that crawl and walk and run stage. But ultimately, you do want to get them on a path towards best practices. But it starts with acknowledging bad practices, doing some things that can buy down risk immediately for no money, and then pointing them at fit for purpose advice in the right order, instead of just platitudes like implement zero trust or
right. Well, and simple things like segregating some of their devices, like even the front office and back office kind of things, like Target was hacked through their HVAC system. There were casinos that were hacked through, aquarium, digital, thermometers, right? Classic stories of or cars being hacked through their entertainment system, where you go through that, then you get to the critical stuff like brakes and things, right?
Well, I know we're probably going to pivot, but let's punctuate this. On our very first birthday for the Cavalry, we wrote the 5-star automotive cyber safety framework. So go to amthecavalry.org/5-star. And it said all systems fail. You should be prepared for failure across these 5 dimensions. And it was, how do you avoid failure, take help avoiding failure without suing the helper, capture, study, learn from failure, contain and isolate failure, and respond against future failure. They have fancier names. But that 4th one, there's no separation between infotainment and critical functions of the car. So the fancy name was, do you separate critical systems from non-critical systems, such that a hack of the radio, like Chris and Charlie did, could never shut off the brakes or turn the steering wheel? And the answer in almost every car is nope. There's no segmentation isolation, not logically, not physically. And we wanted to change that. So we weren't just pointing out that we had risks. We were giving practical frameworks for looking at avoiding failure, at least initially, and those became blueprints for like FDA regulations and like.
The other theme I'm picking up here is that we really need to stop blaming the victims, and I think we do that a lot. I think we put a lot of onus on, well, you shouldn't have done this, you shouldn't have done that. Where in a lot of cases, I think that should have been possible. How do we? So a lot of to me, the shift left is, security by design, and some of these products shouldn't be able to fail in the way they often do, or shouldn't be able to be misconfigured in the way they do. What's your take on that?
Yeah, within that 5-star framework, the medical version we call the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices is the same 5 things. They're just worded in the love language and nouns and verbs of those sectors. But yeah, the first one is safety by design, cyber safety by design. And in it, it's things like, do you do threat modeling? Do you look at your supply chain integrity? Like SBOM, I started my SBOM journey the same time I started my Cavalry journey. I just didn't link them always. But software bill of materials was a growing concern. When you look at like some of these critical infrastructure operators, there's 2 major categories. There's what's the hackability of the supply chain of goods that they're buying and operating. And then there's how well they own and operate them. And it's really difficult, no matter heroism and budget, it's going to defend indefensible things. So I wanted to apply pressure on both fronts, right? I'm an AppSec product security guy by my day job most of the time prior to this mission, including like chief security officer for a publicly traded company on product stuff, right? I teach it for CMU, but there's no software liability still. There's really no accountability for software flaws. And I wanted to raise the hygiene, if not for everything, at least for cyber physical systems that can kill people, like a bedside infusion pump. So we did have significant success on medical devices, but not so much on water and wastewater technologies or high-speed rail or these or that. And the Cavalry's pushing on all fronts that's cyber physical, but we've had varying success over time as we built trust. And the bravest by far was Suzanne Schwartz at FDA, by far. She comes to hacker conferences, sends her people to hacker conferences, collaborates on technical things, on policy things. But we wanted to make sure that hospitals that buy these things have a fighting chance. And if they are flawed, they can be patched. And that the vendors that make them, even though they try to avoid flaws, that they have a coordinating disclosure program inviting hackers acting in good faith without fear of legal reprisal. And so we had to work a lot on decriminalizing security research with CFA and DMCA and guidance and prosecutorial guidance and honing best practices for disclosure programs, even if you don't want a bug bounty. And so we did a lot of the things to enable this kind of prevent failure stuff.
Yeah.
But ultimately as well, the hospitals or the water and wastewater treatment facilities, they have to avail themselves of these superior technologies and then configure and operate them well and notice when something's acting differently. So the pressure needs to be both on the supply chain for these cyber physical goods and the safe operations of them for the life of that deployment, which can often be quite long and quite protracted.
Well, one of the things that I seem to recall you recommending was for some of these organizations to shift from on-prem to cloud. And that is so that you take the responsibility away from maybe these smaller mom and pop shops or smaller companies that don't have the skills to Azure and Amazon Cloud and companies that have the financial wherewithal. Perhaps you could be whipped into shape by the government with some carrots and sticks to get that right. What is that? Am I misunderstanding what your recommendation was?
I mean, it's complicated. And in fact, the reason I laughed is there was a senator, I just testified at the Senate in May on the first loss of life. And one of the senator's questions were trying to pin me into a binary yes or no question on, is cloud safer than non-cloud? And of course I couldn't. I did a good job fending off the line of questioning, but I think within a lens of critical infrastructure or cyber poor, let's put it that way. If you can't keep up with the configuration, hardening, and maintenance of your own Exchange server, you are probably safer with G Suite or Office 365. If you can't maintain, the entire stack of compute for on-prem equipment, you might be able to avail yourself of a lot of the baked-in, built-in, cloud hosted people who live and die by their success at doing a good job at that. Right. And it's not just that they're better at security, it's that they too are reducing complexity, right? So complexity is reduction is always better than adding security almost every case. Mm-hmm. So people that reduce operational complexity, operational variance, I'm a very big fan of Deming and Toyota supply chains and Eli Goldratt and theory of constraints and all these things we know about engineering outside of software and security. There's very applicable ideas about reducing complexity and operational variance and monitoring. And we just haven't really applied them to IT. And I look at cybersecurity of IT or OT as a emergent property of IT choices. It always starts with that. In fact, I have a zombie apocalypse pyramid, like a food guide pyramid I use for my students on where cybersecurity fits in. And it's actually number 3 and 4 on the pyramid, not the bottom 2 layers of the pyramid. And they always chuckle when I do it, but they never forget it. Like I'll have someone who's like a CISO at Walmart come back like 10 years later and say, I remember your zombie pyramid. Because it's over 10 years old now. I think I did it. I think the first time I did it was 2011 in public. At first I did it was 2011 RSA. But if you don't have a competence and an appetite to maintain the hygiene required, then oftentimes a cloud service is better than you doing it yourself. And moreover, this is more of a business point, but like you should focus your talent and strategies and time and budget on the things that only you're good at and let someone else do something that they're better at. But it's not to say that you can't get hacked and some of these things become all your eggs in fewer baskets. I mean, there was a major managed service provider hacked during my time at CISA that affected every single one of their tenants. Yeah. Right. So there's concentration of risk and there's rolling your own. And often for these cyber poor that we were helping, it was probably not wise for them to continue running their own unsupported exchange forever.
When you were testifying, this may have been when you were there for it. I know that you were there talking about the Patch Act, and that was something that you seemed kind of jazzed about at the time. And it's been long enough now that I'd forgotten some of the details. So first of all, what was that proposal about, and what do you like about that proposal? And second, as Reagan, I think, was the guy you said, the scariest words you'll ever hear, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, right? So you've worked with the government, and a lot of people have that attitude, like, don't get the government involved, whatever you do, because they're too slow, they don't do it right or whatever. But what is the role of regulation and legislation here?
Well, these are very different questions. Probably the most important one's the second one, generically, because the Patch Act is, if you don't like regulation, you don't see any role for regulation, then you won't care about my answer for the first one. But I'll give you, if there's healthcare people here, I'll do a thumbnail on Patch Act, but the broader issue is the second question. The Patch Act was an attempt so the FDA that I've been praising, Dr. Suzanne Schwartz at CDRH, Center for Disease and Radiological Health, she's amazing. She has been using the Food and Drug Administration law, the FDA Act, to enforce cybersecurity for pre-market and post-market. So what do you have to do before you can bring a new device to market for the first time? And what do you do for the ongoing care and maintenance through retirement? And if you look at our Hippocratic Oath, it's represented, in one way, shape, or form, and is enhanced continuously through some pre-market things, some post-market things over time. The Patch Act, some of the bigger manufacturers often push back and say, this is just guidance, it's not binding. So the pre-market and post-market guidance are their current interpretation of the law. But what they say in there is, if you have a superior way to meet the intent, go ahead. But generally speaking, a lot of the device makers don't patch their stuff. They don't update software. They don't avoid unsupported operating systems. They don't want to provide software bill of materials like the pre-market's asking for. They don't want to do threat models. So this gave her statutory authority in the law of the land to do that. When you have it in the law, you can also budget against it or appropriate. So lots of civics lessons here. I'll streamline it. The Patch Act basically was going to give her more authority and the ability to budget to raise the guidance to have more teeth.
Okay.
And hospitals loved it because a lot of their breaches or a lot of their risk assessments find these things that they want fixed from the device makers. And the device makers say, we're not allowed to patch, which isn't true. She's clarified that a million times, or we don't have to patch, or she can't make us. So when you do a risk assessment and you see that you have internet facing attack surface with sometimes hard coded passwords or unsupported operating systems that could kill people, you want to shut them down and you can't because there's no teeth here. So it passed the House nearly unanimously. And in the Senate, people lobbied from some of the medical device trade associations lobbied against it really hard. And they said some untrue things and they spun it. And so during my testimony, I was just saying, they're like, how can we help? How can Congress help? It wasn't about a bill or anything. They were just saying, how bad is cybersecurity? You said that it's killed people. Show us how you got to that conclusion. And so we walked them through the data science. But I just, in the process of answering a question, I said, hospitals are dying to get the Patch Act passed. So please have the political will to at least consider their needs. And I'm sure it wasn't perfect as in language, but FDA was very fond of it. And most of the hospitals, especially victims of ransomware attacks, were fond of it. But, there's a lot of money in politics. And
so what happened?
Since then, I don't know the date you're going to air this, but since then, in the Senate version, it was attached to a 5-year renewal of the user fees for the FDA. And it's just a package of, whenever you have good legislative language, it has to have a vehicle. So a lot of things go through the National Defense Authorization Act, which happens every year. It's must-pass legislation for the military. This one was going to go through a vehicle called user fees, which funds a bunch of other stuff. So they successfully kicked it out of the negotiations for user fees. So it currently has no pathway to a vote. I believe I heard that there were some alternative vehicles that might still get through, but Congress ends its 2-year session fairly shortly. If it's not in there already, it's very low likelihood. I had to learn all about this over my 9-year journey here.
Right.
But look, I think your more substantive question is, a lot of hacker friends, they hear government and they just groan. They hear legislation like they assume it's bad. I don't love that default reflexive attitude, and I share it. Right, I shared it, and I understand how they feel. I felt that way. I found a different balance. Right, the feel felt found. Eli Sugarman was running the Hewlett Foundation's charitable wing and was funding a lot of cyber stuff. And he had this wonderful line. I can't remember exactly because we've kind of enhanced it together over time, but it was something like, because he reminded me, like, I think it was Charitable Foundation invented radar, or sonar or whatever, not radar, sonar or something like that. And he had a bunch of examples of where charitable organizations often do things that benefit society. And he had this incredible line. Let's talk about the public-private partnership, which is a horribly broken model right now. It maybe always will be. But the idea is the private sector is people who act in their own private interest, their own shareholders, their own startup, their own household's income, private goods. And there are things that are public goods that everybody needs. Everybody needs. So the private sector is private interests and the public sector is public good and public interests. And the role of government is public. And the role of any company is private. And generally speaking, all the talent and innovation is in the private sector, right? Governments are bureaucratic and slow, and there's lots of cliches. Some of them are true, some of them are unfair. But we have them because it's supposed to be a tension and a check and a balance, right? Sometimes what's right for the individual is wrong for the country. And so you want a public-private tension and different optimums. And so the public sector, we got the 3 branches of government. We could easily have a civics lesson. Let me short circuit most of that. Generally speaking, hackers look at any legislation as kill it with fire. It's going to make things worse, unintended consequences, et cetera. And early in my career was very much against regulatory stuff. I called PCI the No Child Left Behind Act for Information Security. And I made a lot of enemies because they love PCI. They said, this is the best thing we have. It creates budgets. I'm like, no, it's static, brittle, old solutions to a dynamic evolutionary problem. It's not working and blah, blah, blah. What I came to realize is it's not do you or don't you regulate. It's like saying fire is good or fire is bad. It's like It's how do you use it? Where do you use it? And is it based on static, brittle things with unintended consequences, or is it based on evergreen principles? And what I realize is something that makes you buy antivirus for your PCI card and data environment when very few of us can rely on antivirus for much anymore these days is a bad example of regulation, but something that says, hey, you probably shouldn't have something that's both hackable and not patchable. So be patchable, right? That's evergreen. Or have coordinated disclosure programs, or so that even if you miss something, you can fix it later, or avoid hard-coded fixed passwords. Like, which things are the cyber seat belts, right? We used to have cars with no seat belts and no safety features. And the automotive industry said, oh my God, you're going to destroy profits. You're going to put us out of business.
Right.
Well, we did all those things and we're not out of business.
Right.
Kitchens and restaurants, like, we're getting food poisoning and salmonella into their customers. So we created minimum sanitation codes for commercial restaurants. And you can still make profitable and delicious meals, even though you have to buy rat traps and bleach your counters, right? So when a private decision affects public safety or human life, we regulate. And there is a role for that. So Eli's line that I orphaned is that there are things the public sector can't do, and that they lack the skills or the expertise, but the private sector won't do. So let me say that again. There are things the public sector can't do, but the private sector won't do. And to that, it falls to altruism and groups like Am the Cavalry is what he would say. It's like the nonprofits, the civil societies, the altruists. And I said, well, that's nice as an error handling routine, but it's not a place to live. It can't be a permanent home for these. Maybe what we can do is catch the things that fall through the cracks in philanthropy, but they need to be assigned somewhere. And since a private organization has a fiduciary responsibility to drive shareholder value, what's right for the shareholders can be wrong for the country, right? So putting poison in reservoirs could be good for profits, but bad for the town that lives nearby. Shutting off your pipeline in an abundance of caution so that you can get billing done and maybe not hurt your OT side because you didn't do enough rehearsals in advance or do separation and segmentation might have been okay for your company, but deny the Eastern Seaboard gas for a week.
Right.
If it was in the winter, it could have been heating oil. So a private good should not trump a public good. These are market failures. These are things like tragedy of the commons. You might have heard that term. When everyone acts in their own selfish interest, it hurts everybody. It's like overfishing. Right. There's no more fish.
Right.
So without getting into too much more of a civics lesson, pulling back, Bruce Schneier had a good line early in my time when I went to the think tank, the Atlantic Council, and he would say it's not legislation or no legislation. It's informed, technically literate legislation or illiterate legislation. And my attitude when I started the Cavalry is they're going to regulate. Let's make sure that we give them a helping hand and a technical voice of reason to make sure that we're focused on evergreen, helpful things instead of static, brittle, unhelpful things. Now, some hackers still think they'll never get it right or they'll get misused or abused. And maybe they're right, but you can't just have this be wild, wild west. Every single part of our society that has the potential to lead to loss of life or public safety concerns, aviation, commercial restaurants, drug manufacturing, food supply, cars, they all have some minimum hygiene requirements or minimum safety requirements. And these are safety issues.
Right. All right. So as we wrap up here, you've mentioned several things along the way, but let's kind of tidy this up. What if I'm out there and I'm perhaps running one of these companies, I'm a hospital administrator, I'm working for one of these organizations, a utility company or whatever. When I was researching this, I found there are actually lots of organizations, even lots of federal organizations that potentially you might turn to. Where do you start? Where would you recommend people go to start their journey into this stuff, and how do they reach out for help?
So you're not going to like my answer because I think the world's changing. One truism that no one likes it when I say it is that our quote best practices that predate the last 5 years or so, they predate the ransomware revolution. They likely aren't anymore. Doesn't mean you throw them away. It just means adversaries have evolved, impacts have grown. We need to evolve too. And if you're still saying the same things you said before the pandemic, I'm not saying the pandemic caused this, but concurrent with the pandemic was this much more aggressive adversary activity on critical infrastructure, the willingness to attack things that used to be off limits, and the elevated consequences of harm has generated significant bipartisan political will domestically and internationally and in the White House So there's a willingness that the harms that have manifested are now catalyzing government public sector action. Hopefully technically literate and helpful minimum touch government action, but they are definitely triggering government action. So part of the idea here is many of the people, when they said, what should we do with our government action? They're trotting out stuff that we know doesn't work because we had an untested hypothesis because the adversaries didn't show up. The adversaries have shown up. We've tested it. It's not enough.
Yeah.
So that could lead to nihilism if you said, what do I do right now? And I could say, well, don't trust the best practices. That's not really what I mean. But I think we have to exercise some real pragmatism here. And one thing that didn't exist until 4 years ago was CISA, and CISA is still getting its feet underneath them. And I have a lot of criticisms of the agency I worked for, past, present, and future. I mean, it's going to take a while. Mm-hmm. Is the notion is cybersecurity for cyber physical systems is going to require different practices, bad, good, better, best than traditional enterprise security advice. So there's a growing body of practical advice, and CISA is supposed to come up with common performance goals across all 16, now 17 critical infrastructure sectors like water, food supply, oil and gas, electricity, healthcare. And the sector specific agencies, or now they're called sector risk management agencies, are supposed to layer on top of that. So you're supposed to get some generic advice from CISA and some free taxpayer funded services if you're domestic. And then the EPA is supposed to help you if you're in water and wastewater. And HHS is supposed to tell you what else to do if you're in hospitals or medical technologies. So it's a hand in glove shared responsibility where CISA is looking with the National Risk Management Center to identify and buy down risk. And what I'm encouraged about, it's not out yet by the time of this airing, but the White House has an incredibly bold national cybersecurity strategy. And in it, they're already telegraphing pieces of it. Yeah. And I've done some table read. It specifically calls out some of the most exposed bottom of Maslow's subsets of that infrastructure. It's talking about water. It's talking about electricity. It's talking about small, medium, rural hospitals and emergency communications and emergency services. So by focus on some of the things that are too critical to fail, that underpin basic human needs like water and food and shelter and safety, they are directing sprints and action from the sector risk management agencies and CISA to have practical crawl, walk, run, meet them where they are. I'm very proud of how much that target-rich cyber poor terminology is permeating the executive branch and legislative branch. It comes up all the time now. Mm-hmm. So kudos to Wendy and kudos to our team for seeding catchy terms here. But that advice is forthcoming. And instead of just saying do everything or do best practices or do zero trust and just failing to actually buy down risk, we're looking for ways that actually materially reduce risk. And in some cases, that's going to be hardening your bad environments. In other cases, we've been even bolder and said you need a cash for clunkers to buy back and replace really unsupported end-of-life stuff. Like the most dangerous internet-facing technologies have to go. Yeah. So if one of these organizations can't replace their exchange, we wanted to convene at the White House and say, hey, Microsoft, hey, Google, will you subsidize a one-time program to help these critical infrastructure targets modernize their mail, Yeah. Because these are public goods, just like we don't have our own standing armies by the town and the state level. We have federally funded pooled resources for certain things. No one should have to wonder if a cyber attack from Putin or a Russian criminal could shut off the water for a month or more or delay integrated hospital care for a month or more.
Yeah.
These are things we shouldn't mess with. And we unfortunately are.
All right. Last question before we go. And it's, as always with me, it's a multi-part, but after, 9 years of doing this, do you find yourself more or less optimistic in what's next for Am the Cavalry? And if I want to get involved, if I am a technologist or not, if I want to actually get out there and make a difference myself, how might you recommend that I do that?
Oh, those are too hard to answer. So 9 years is the cavalry journey, but I've been on this with Rugged and on my other career longer. I'm really doing a lot of soul searching after my emergency federal service because I'm in some ways a walking, talking contradiction. I simultaneously know the growing need for a strong and vibrant public sector and and government partners. And I've treasured the strong government partners I've had to date, like Leonard Bailey at DOJ or Suzanne Schwartz at FDA. And like when we have, or Langevin in Congress, now that he's not running again, but we've had some incredibly powerful and incredible and very civically minded public servants that have teamed with us, right? So I know we need that. And I saw horrible failures and shortcomings and self-defeating behavior that contributed to elective loss of life during my federal emergency service. And I am demoralized by how far we are from current state to desired state, even for the newest federal agency with all the money and permission in the world. There's so much more to do. So I look at the way the world is, and I'm more, in some ways, more pessimistic than I've ever been. And I'm not a pessimist. And I know that it takes a refusal to accept the status quo and stubborn people to change the world. And many of us are taking the successes and failures from that emergency federal service, and we're building upon it. Bad practices is very popular. Target-rich cyber poor has shifted from just looking at the richest critical infrastructure operators and big hospitals down to the smallest of them that need the most help. So you can't fix a problem until you know what you have. So, the whole G.I. Joe thing of knowing is half the battle. I think the silver lining here is we are way behind. The adversaries have set the pace. We're going to have this ransomware scourge for a while, and the private sector is not helping much yet on it. There's no money in it. The attackers have figured out how to monetize the cyber poor. Defenders have not. So it's currently a feeding frenzy. Yeah. And the government needs to find its legs. But, I'm encouraged by the Office of the National Cyber Director and Chris Inglis's new team. I'm encouraged by this bold strategy from the White House. I am discouraged by how much pushback it's getting from the private sector. But this public-private partnership has been imbalanced. The public sector has a role to play. And I'd encourage anyone listening that instead of saying what's wrong with their ideas, focus on what's right, help them be more literate. They need to take some action. I think the quote from Chris Inglis yesterday or the day before is, free market forces only take you so far. And there's a role for government power. We want to use it sparingly, but it's time to use it. So hold your nose, eat your lima beans. Don't say fire bad. Like, let's figure out how to use these tools well and assist them and be measured about it, for sure. But we're in an interesting and dangerous moment in history. I think we need to figure out that a new public-private partnership, and maybe it involves public-private and hackers, or civil society at least. And not a succinct answer for you, but I'll end like this. I don't know what the future is for the cavalry. Every year I wonder if it's time to end the cavalry. And when we started, there was no CISA, and now there's an entire agency theoretically in the mission space, but they're not up to their full fighting force yet. So each year I say, what's the role of the cavalry going forward? And I encourage you to watch our B-Sides Las Vegas track from this year, because that was the theme of both days. We said we were telling people stuff could be on fire, was flammable. It's on fire now, and everybody knows it. So now what? How does the mission change? And we were Socratic about it. We've got some answers, but ultimately we shouldn't have to exist, right? The idea of meeting people where they are, using empathy, trying to be a bridge builder and a coalition builder is always going to be necessary and important. But if you want to get involved, I'm the cavalry.org, CAVALRY, not Calvary. That's where they killed Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
But whether it's this or some other effort, there's, CTI League, there's, DEFCON policies growing in ranks, but we are not just a hobby anymore.
There's the U.S. Digital Service as well. What do you know about that?
Oh, there's plenty. I mean, these are some of the teammates that we're finding. State Department's trying to do some things abroad as well, because these are not just target-rich cyber poor U.S. critical infrastructure. We're worried about food supply everywhere. We're worried about connected technology everywhere. And we have participation internationally. Like a lot of my favorite members are in Europe or Asia. So I think we got to mature though, because we're not just a hobby, and we can't just say we don't want government involved. And I think what we have to do is roll up our sleeves and be good faith partners to give them things that are focused not on what we want, but what the broader society needs. One of the ways I tend to end lots of talks is, as the world's increasingly dependent on technology, they're increasingly dependent on you, right? This is not a spectator sport anymore. And a lot of us are jaded or burned out for our enterprise security, but that was always about money and records. Right. This is about public safety, human life, your own family, your own ability to have the things you need. And right now we've had too many protracted disruptions. I mean, Jackson, Mississippi right now, it's not because of hacking, but it easily could have been. Yeah. in the second month of water not fit for pregnant women and kids to drink. I mean, this is we don't want this to look like a third world country. And as we've connected everything to everything else, we have exposed ourselves to accidents and adversaries, and those adversaries are increasingly willing to disrupt us. So we have some catch up to do, and we're in a fairly dangerous moment in history. But if you think someone else is going to fix it for you, they won't. That's the theme of the cavalry all along, right? They're not coming. But, what are you willing and able to do remains the question. And if this strikes a chord in your heart, let's figure out how to work together.
Well said. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thanks for everything you've done. You've obviously been out there doing a lot of great things and been involved in a lot of great projects. So thanks for doing what you've done.
Thank you.
I'm really glad we finally got Josh on the show. I appreciate him coming on. That was I think, an extremely important discussion. And if you found that at all inspiring, be sure to check out amthecavalry.org. Of course, there's a link at the show notes for that. If you want to get plugged in, you can send an email. Send an email to info@amthecavalry.org. I just did that myself. I want to, kind of see what those guys are up to and see if there's some way I can help out. Another thing you might want to look at if you're in the IT space at all, or even adjacent to that, you might check out Josh's Rugged Manifesto. It's all about being resilient, being robust, redundancy. Making your code, in this case, though it could be generalized to other things as well, rugged, making it durable, spending the time to make sure that things are done with quality, that you've built in, security and privacy from the start so that we could avoid having problems in the first place. There are links to this in the show notes, along with other things, many things we talked about today. I've got a link to the DEF CON 21 talk 9 years ago where this I Am the Cavalry thing was sort of announced, I think officially, or maybe that's where it really got kicked off because so many people saw that. That's well worth watching. And then he also mentioned the B-Sides, which is another security conference. There's a talk there of kind of about what's happened in those last 9 years, successes and failures and where they need to go. Links to all that are in the show notes. I also wanted to mention a couple books that you might want to read. First of all, I think a very apropos book here is Click Here to Kill Everybody by Bruce Schneier. I just finished reading that one recently myself. That's a really good book. It's very sobering, of course, but it's all the different kind of ways that our systems are very dependent now. And they're all hooked up to the internet, and they're not as secure as they should be, and what some of the consequences may be. So I think that's very much in line with our talk today with Josh. But I also want to recommend this other fiction book. It's called 1 Second After. It's actually part of, I think, a trilogy now. I've only read the first one personally. But basically, there's a technological disaster. I don't want to give too much away. But it really kind of brings to light a lot of the things that we take for granted in modern life. Again, it just kind of helps you think about where we have vulnerabilities in our society, that are exposed when we lose access to certain modern conveniences that we take for granted. I think it's, again, in line with this, and it is a good book. It's an entertaining read, and I think it also kind of goes to this whole kind of thought of ruggedness and being prepared. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Next week will be my Best of 2022 show, where I've pulled in some of the best snippets of the podcast over the last year. I'm also going to throw in some of the bonus content that I've so far only given to my patrons. After every podcast, every week, I've got some bonus content, either extra questions with the guest or for my top patrons. I've also got a thing I've called Merlin's Musings, where I just kind of talk about some tech topics or some personal topics. And so just to give you a little taste of that, I'm going to bring in a couple of those into that show as well. So I've got some great shows coming up. Subscribe if you haven't. I'd love to get some more 5-star reviews from you guys on Apple Music. That really does help. And if you would, share some of these promotions and things with your friends on social media and so forth. I'm trying to reach more people, and that's kind of why I'm doing these things. So now is a great time to do that. All right, everybody, take care. Until next week, as always, stay safe out there and don't get caught with your drawbridge down.